this lecture, we're going to be talking about the intake, interview, and quality review training that you'll need to take the corresponding exam in order to get your certifications for VITA this year. And so the IRS was helpful with this one, and they provided basically a slide deck here, as those of you who have taken a look at this training material will know. And so rather than my usual going through a slide deck that I've made, I'm just going to guide you through the one that the IRS has made. We will get started now. And so the first thing we need to talk about is what are some of the main objectives for this training today. So by the end of the lesson, we will be able to describe the purpose of following a consistent intake, interview, and quality review process, because that's very important to understand why we are doing things. The different sections of Form 13614-C, the form that we have talked so much about in the last lecture on the VSC, which if you have not watched that, I would recommend watching that one before this one, as they will build off of each other somewhat. But again, Form 13614-C, incredibly important, and that's going to be a recurring theme throughout this entire training. And we're going to understand the basic steps to complete the intake process, the basic steps of the interview process, and the basic steps for the quality review process. And even though everyone may not be carrying out all of those roles, it's still important that everyone has a holistic understanding of how a VITA site operates, and those are three critical components to it. And so, as a brief introduction here, and this will touch on some of what we've talked about already, taxpayers using services offered through VITA and the TCE programs should be confident that they receive quality service, and this includes having an accurate tax return prepared. So that really is one of our main goals, is making sure that every return we prepare is accurate. And a basic component of preparing an accurate return begins with explaining the tax preparation process, completing all the questions on Form 13614-C, listening to the taxpayer and asking the right questions. Basically, what this means is that it's not enough to just have the skills in order to prepare an accurate tax return or the knowledge, but you have to follow a systemic process and follow the steps in order to ensure that the standard is being met. And getting into specifics here, Form 13614-C, the Intake, Interview, and Quality Review Sheet, is a tool designed to help ensure taxpayers are given the opportunity to provide all needed information before their tax return is prepared, and when used properly, this form effectively contributes to accurate tax return preparation. I can tell you from personal experience that is 100% true, and we will definitely be using those sheets for every single return that we prepare, and everyone will become very familiar with them, trust me. So, what is the main purpose of this training? So, really the main purpose of this training is that the IRS continues to emphasize that there is in fact a positive correlation between the proper use of the intake and interview steps and the quality review process and the preparation of an accurate return. Basically, what this means is that an accurate return is far more likely to happen if we have a good system in place for the intake interview and the quality review. Additionally, the IRS oversight reviews indicate that consistent use of complete intake, interview, and quality review processes result in more accurate returns, and when properly used, the accuracy of VITA/TCE returns is increased, which basically just says, we already talked about, have a good process in place for each of these steps, you can prepare more accurate returns. Additionally, per quality site requirement number 2, it is in fact mandatory that Form 13614-C is completed for each tax return that is prepared. And importantly here, volunteers who refuse to prepare returns without following the correct intake and interview process are in violation of the VSC. But again, these are relatively simple steps to follow, and again, as long as you let Form 13614-C guide you, that will take care of a lot of the work for itself. And emphasizing that point even more, the IRS's data shows that in most cases, the form is available at all sites and taxpayers are completing the form. However, there are still challenges with certified volunteer preparers not using this tool during the interview and quality review process. And so, in summation, this training is designed to encourage all volunteers to follow through a consistent and thorough intake, interview, and quality review process, which we will also talk more about when we actually have our in-person trainings, but this is an excellent start that you need in order to pass that exam. And so I'm just going to flash up here on the screen. Here are some materials that we're typically going to need when it comes to having a good intake interview and a good quality review. And so I'll leave that up for a second, and then I will advance on to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to move on. And again, you can find this publication in the email that I sent out to everyone, and so you should be able to find all of these links. And so here, finally, I know I've talked a ton about Form 13614-C, and for those of you that have participated in VITA before, this is going to look incredibly familiar to you. But for those of you that haven't, you've probably been wondering what the form actually looks like, and the reason I didn't show it sooner was because it was going to get shown in this training. And importantly here, you can find this form in publication 4012, which, as we've talked about before, is really something you're going to use for every single return. So I would highly recommend that you spend some time in 4012 getting familiar with this form, and we're going to spend some more time within this training talking about each of the components that make up this form, because it's really incredibly important and it will make your life so much easier if you know how to properly use it. So now we're going to talk about the intake process and how we complete Form 13614-C. So the methods for completing this form may vary from site to site. In most cases, the taxpayer is going to complete pages 1 through 3, that will happen at our site, of the form before meeting with the tax preparer. And then importantly, the preparer has to discuss the information that the taxpayer provided on the form. And it says that some sites may prefer that volunteer tax preparers complete the intake form with the taxpayer while conducting an interview. In our case, in general, as for our system, we're going to have the taxpayer complete it for themselves at the beginning. And then at all sites, this is mandatory, volunteers will complete the form with the taxpayer if assistance is required. So basically what this means is if they need help completing the form, we're not just going to make them guess, we're going to help them out, and it will not be a problem to do that. And again, driving home the point that we've talked about in the last training as well, no matter what method is used, all questions on the form must be answered. And taxpayers at virtual VITA sites also need to complete a consent form here, Form 14446 virtual VITA/TC taxpayer consent, to give consent for the site to prepare the return using the methods outlined in the form, and both spouses need to sign this form if they are married filing jointly. And again, it's printed, this form, in both English and Spanish, and it can also be downloaded from irs.gov in other foreign languages in case we run into that this year. And so, as we've talked about already, when we're talking about the intake process of actually bringing a taxpayer into our site and starting the preparation of a return, one of the first steps is verifying identity. And the reason why this is so important is that identity theft continues to be a nationwide problem, and that the interview that the preparer conducts, because again, if you remember back from our last training, only a certified tax law preparer can conduct an interview, and that interview should begin by requiring photo ID to verify the identity of the taxpayer and spouse on the return. And occasionally, we can make exceptions for requiring a photo ID, but it only should be made under extreme circumstances, and it is something that has to be approved by the site coordinator, and it's not something that we typically will do. So usually it's a pretty firm rule, we need an ID. Occasionally we can make an exception, but in general, we definitely need that ID when we're starting the intake process. And so we talked about this a little bit in our last training here, and this will probably make more sense now, with the different levels of certification that are on Form 13614-C. And so the site has to have a process to ensure that the return is within scope of the VITA-TC program and to identify the certification level needed for the tax return. The site must also have a process to ensure volunteers have the certification needed for returns that they prepare. And so typically a lot of this for us is going to be done at the greeters table. We're going to try to sort all of this out, and we'll have procedures in place that we'll talk about more at that. But the really important thing to understand here is that on this form, you're going to see next to areas that have such as income and expenses, parentheses B, parentheses A, parentheses M. And basically what this means is the certification level needed for that component of the return. And so if they check no over here, then it doesn't matter per se what the lettering is here. But if they check yes, it is important because it tells you what certification level is needed. And as we talked about in the last training, that the highest level of certification required for an item is what the overall certification level required for the return is. So for example, if we had 1 checked here for wages and salary, and we had B checked here for scholarships and we had A checked here for tip income, it would be an advanced return because the tip income requires an advanced certification level, and that is the highest certification level out of all of the checked boxes. And so, moving forward here with the interview process, one important thing to point out is that you should not begin entering taxpayer information into the software until you have completed a thorough interview with the taxpayer, because you may find some specific things during this interview. First off, the tax return may be above your certification level, and it's very important that we catch this because that would need to be routed to a different volunteer. But again, for us, we're going to try as best we can to have everyone to have the same certification level. Secondly, the tax return could be outside the scope of the VITA/TCE program. There are specific things that we cannot do. We will try to catch those again at the greeter table, but it is still something you need to be aware of as a preparer when you are starting the interview with the taxpayer. And then third, the taxpayer may not have all of the needed information or documentation. And while we can often rely on their statements as long as they seem justified to us, there are times where we do need information or documentation, such as having proof of Social Security. And discovering these things before starting a return will save your self-time, and it will save the taxpayer's time, and it will help them avoid the frustration. Because even though it may be frustrating to have that caught at the beginning, it's going to be much more frustrating if it's caught during the quality review and they've just sunk a substantial amount of time into the process. So, diving into a little more detail on the interview process, one of the things that's really important is clarifying questions. And this is something that I cannot emphasize enough, because the interview process should not just be about changing answers from unsure to yes or no on the intake sheet, but instead you need to make sure that the information that's recorded on that sheet is in fact correct. And so you should update or correct the intake sheet with any changes identified during the interview with the taxpayer. And this review and discussion is a great opportunity to engage the taxpayer in a conversation and make sure that the taxpayer understands all of the questions and that you understand all of their answers. Clarifying information while reviewing Form 13614-C during the interview is a very effective way to gather all information needed. And this is something you should really be doing for every single return you prepare, and I cannot emphasize it enough that you should be asking questions such as the examples on the screen here. You marked that no one else lived in your home. Is that correct? And you see, this is a good question because you see the number of dependents or people that live in your home can greatly impact your return. And so it's something you want to make sure is correct on the taxpayer's intake sheet. And then another one, is your pension your only source of income? So the reason why this is a good question is because having a pension as the only source of income is probably something that is a little bit unique, and it's something that could affect the return if there are other sources of income that say are not being reported or that they didn't understand fit in any of those boxes. Because occasionally there will be something where they don't know exactly what box it fits in, and so they're not sure which box to check, and you'll probably have a better idea. So really important to ask those clarifying questions. So we talked about this a little bit in the last training, but within the interview, you need to be on the lookout for conflicting information. So be alert for conflicting information. Sometimes an entry on one part will raise a question on another part of Form 13614-C. So a few examples for this is that, quote, I see that you and your husband both worked, yet you did not indicate that you paid any childcare expenses for your 3-year-old son. So this is a good question because you figure that obviously someone has to be watching the 3-year-old son because he's probably not old enough to go to school. And so there's probably a justification for this, but it's also important to ask this because you may be able to find another credit for them for those childcare expenses. Or another example is, I see that you are over the age of 65, but you did not indicate that you received Social Security benefits. So again, here, if you're over the age of 65, in general, you should be receiving Social Security benefits, and so it's important to clarify why this is not the case for the taxpayer. And third, I see that you answered no to the question, can anyone claim you on their tax return? But since you're a student living with your parents, I'm wondering if they can claim you. And so, again, this is one that we will actually see often, and I want to really emphasize this one because the important wording here is can, not will anyone claim you on their tax return. And so this is one thing that I would say we end up seeing a lot at our site, is that people mark no to this when they should actually mark yes, because it doesn't matter if someone actually is going to claim them as a dependent often. It matters if they can claim them as a dependent. So that's one that I would particularly be on the lookout for, because we work with college students so often and it's a really easy mistake to make. So getting into the first part of the form, as we talked about, we're going to go through the different components of it. The first part is the personal information of the taxpayer. And so during the interview, it's important to make sure that all of these information that has been entered in this part is correct and that all of the names match the Social Security document. So you see here, they'll put in their first name, they'll put in their last name, their middle initial, they'll give us a phone number, they'll tell us if they're a U.S. citizen, if they're married filing jointly. Then we're going to include a spouse's name and their last name and ask if they are a U.S. citizen. We're going to collect their address information in here, their date of birth, their occupation. Wow, got tongue-tied there. And so then we're also going to move on to here some important life facts, such as if they're a full-time student, if they're legally blind, if they are totally and permanently disabled, and then we'll ask the same information about their spouse. And then again, the important question here, can, not will, anyone claim you or your spouse as a dependent? And so here we're just going to go into more detail about some of these personal information items that we talked about. And so these are really important that these are covered because they can have many tax law determinations. For example, when a taxpayer is a full-time student, it may impact multiple tax law issues such as child and dependent care credit, retirement savings, contributions credit, various education credits, and whether the taxpayer can in fact be claimed as a dependent. So again, very important to make sure that this is correct and the information in part 1 is correct. And so here in the interview process, moving forward here as we talked about, the fact that the taxpayer is totally or permanently disabled or legally blind may affect multiple tax law issues, such as the personal exemption, pension taxability, where a taxpayer can be claimed as a dependent. So again, we're just driving home the point here. It's really important that this area in part 1 is filled out correctly. And so here, as we move on to part 2 of the sheet, this is really related to marital status and household information. So the information in this section will help you make determinations about filing status, dependents, and various credits and deductions. And so you'll see here, we ask the taxpayer what their marital status is, if they're never married, married, divorced, legally separated, or widowed. Each of these will have an impact on their filing status, and additionally, dependents will have an impact on their filing status as well. So here we ask them to list the names below of everyone who lived with you in the last year other than your spouse and anyone you supported but did not live with you last year. And so each of those are very important, and it's important that we thoroughly review this section with the taxpayer. Okay, and now moving on to page 2, really this part is important because this is going to tell us what the certification level needed is, and it's going to be where the taxpayer tells us some other facts, such as what their income and expenses are that they had and what these specific types of income are. And so a critical part of the interview process is to make sure that all questions on page 2 of form 13614-C are complete. The taxpayer may have left a question unanswered or marked the question unsure because they did not understand it. These questions should be discussed with the taxpayer to determine the correct yes or no response and recorded on the form prior to beginning the tax return. So as you'll see here, this left column is yes, which they'll check if, say, they had wages or salary or tip income or scholarships. No, if they did not have any of that type of income. Or for a third option, unsure. In any box here that is unsure, you need to make sure that that gets changed to a yes or a no and discuss with the taxpayer why they marked unsure and figure out what the correct option is. And so drilling in with a little more detail into part 3 here related to income, as we talked about, the taxpayers are asked about income received and they should check the appropriate line item yes, no, or unsure. Each income item includes the types of forms used to report the income, in parentheses, As you discuss each of the questions, ensure that the answers agree with the documents provided by the taxpayer. You should change the original answer on Form 13614-C with any updated information as needed, and update the form with any changes from the taxpayer's original answers. So again, as we talked about, really important here to make sure that nothing is unsure and to make sure that their documents do in fact agree with what they marked on the sheet, and make any edits if you need to make them. And so, drilling into a little more detail on income here, you must conduct an extensive interview to ensure that taxpayers who are self-employed are reporting all income, including cash received for work performed. And you should always verify the taxpayers provide all the necessary source documents and information. And so, this is actually way more common than you would think, because often roles in the gig economy, such as driving for Uber or delivering for DoorDash or Grubhub, will actually be listed as self-employment income and how they're reported to the IRS for tax purposes. And so this is also something that we need to be aware of in ensuring that self-employed individuals are in fact reporting all of their income. And continuing on with income here, it is necessary to ask clarifying questions even if all questions on Form 13614-C have been answered. For example, if the taxpayer checks yes to the question distribution from pensions, annuities, and or IRA, and they've already given you a Form 1099-R from an IRA distribution, you should ask, is this your only distribution? At that point, you may find the taxpayer left a Form 1099-R at home and will have to return with it before the return can be prepared. So again, as we talked about earlier, clarifying questions are really important. It's really important that you go through for each part of the income that they mark and ask them about it and make sure that what they are reporting on that form is accurate. And so on to the next part 4 here, we're going to talk about expenses. And so questions in this section should help alert you to expenses paid by the taxpayer that may affect their return. The fact that a taxpayer had an expense is not the only consideration for a tax deduction or credit. You will need to use your reference materials to determine eligibility for deductions and credits and take into consideration the most advantageous position for the taxpayer. So as you'll see here, this section is going to follow a really similar format to the income section, in where it's cut off here, but this says yes, this says no, this says unsure, and you go down here and it's going to tell you the different kinds of expenses that they may have. And so life events that we would talk about here can affect their tax return. And so the life events section, which is part 5 of Form 13614-C, asks numerous questions that relate to the calculation of tax and the processing of the return. And so again here, it's going to follow the same format as income and expenses, and it's going to give you the certification level on the sides, and you're going to have the options yes, no, or unsure. And it's really important again that these are correct and that we ask clarifying questions here, because they can actually have a huge impact on the taxpayer. And so on page 3 of Form 13614-C, there's going to be some additional information that the taxpayer will enter. And so the taxpayer will indicate how they want to receive their refund, as well as other information which may be needed to complete the return. Demographic information in this section may be collected and entered in the tax software, and it's important to ask the site coordinator about how to record the demographic information. And so as you'll see here, some elements of this are optional, such as providing an email address or contributing to the presidential election campaign fund. And you see here, it's going to talk about how you would like a refund if you would like it. If you would have a balance due, do you want to make that payment directly from a bank account? And we'll enter that bank account information into TaxSlayer. And here, other question, do you live in an area that was declared federal disaster? Or did you or your spouse, if filing jointly, receive a letter from the IRS? And then down here is where they talk about the demographic information. And so getting on to page 4, which is Form 15080, this form is used by sites to obtain the taxpayer's consent to make their tax return information available to any VITA/TC site that the taxpayer selects to have their tax return prepared at in the next filing season. Taxpayer has the option to decline this consent, and the site coordinator, myself, will instruct you on the site's procedures on how this form will be completed by the taxpayer. And so as a little review from the VSC, but it's also important here during the interview to think about as well, is due diligence, key part of the interview process. So IRS certified volunteer preparers are required to exercise due diligence. This means that as a volunteer, you're required to do your part when preparing or quality reviewing a tax return to ensure that the information on the return is correct and complete. Generally, as an IRS certified volunteer, you can rely in good faith on the information from a taxpayer without requiring documentation as verification. However, part of due diligence requires asking a taxpayer clarifying questions that may appear to be inconsistent or complete if you discover information that seems that way. When reviewing information for its accuracy, you need to ask yourself if the information is unusual or questionable. For example, you do not need to see proof of a taxpayer's cash contribution to a charity if you feel comfortable that this information is not unusual or questionable. Remember, if you are not comfortable with the information provided by a taxpayer, you are not obligated to prepare the tax return. That last part is really important to emphasize, is that while we generally do take what the taxpayers say as being truthful, it's also important to have a healthy level of skepticism and be on the lookout for areas where information seems to be inconsistent, and you are well within your rights to not prepare that return or to ask a site coordinator or a more experienced volunteer for help. And so preparing the tax return. After you complete the intake interview process, you're going to prepare the return in the tax preparation software, which for us is going to be TaxSlayer Online. Consult references and tools to determine the filing status, dependents, income, adjustments, deductions, credits, or payments. Again, this whole thing here, I cannot emphasize it enough. Publication 4012 is your friend, and use it. And remember, as it says, which I just talked about, publication 4012 contains tax law information and guidance on using tools embedded in the IRS provided software. Other references include publication 17 and volunteer tax alerts. Once the return is prepared, quality reviewer will use the quality review checklist, which again is located in publication 4012, to complete the quality review. I know, shocking, it's in publication 4012. You should probably be seeing a pattern here that this is going to be very important for every return, just as the intake interview and quality review form is. And so getting into a little bit of the quality review process, the purpose of the quality review is to ensure that the taxpayer's tax return is accurate based on the intake/interview sheet and the supporting documents provided by the taxpayer and the interview with the taxpayer. Sites will conduct a quality review of every return prepared. Having a second pair of eyes focused on the quality review offers the best opportunity to correct small errors before they can cause big problems. The quality review takes place after the return is prepared, but before the taxpayer signs the return. So again, purpose of the quality review again really is to have a second set of eyes to make sure that the returns that we are preparing are in fact accurate. And so an important thing to touch on here is what the acceptable method of quality review is. And so the quality review method that a site uses depends on site size, the number of experienced volunteers available, and the certification level of volunteers at that site. And so there are two acceptable methods. Designated review. This preferred quality review method employs a designated quality reviewer, a volunteer who is solely dedicated to reviewing returns prepared by the other volunteers at the site. And then we also have peer review. When a designated quality reviewer is not available, volunteers can review each other's returns. And so in the case of our site, we are primarily going to be using a designated review model, and so that will be clearly indicated who is a quality reviewer and who is a preparer. It will even be so clear that there will be two separate rooms for the quality reviewers and the preparers. And note, self-review, quality reviewing a return that you prepared, is never an acceptable quality review method. I think that kind of goes without saying, but it's an important point to drive home that, again, self-review, you can never do it. Do not ever do it. And here are a couple important publications for volunteers that will be participating in the quality review process that you can review if you so choose. And so there are 4 critical actions talked about within the quality review process. So the quality review process must include the 4 critical actions, which are engaging the taxpayer in the review process. It's really important that they participate because it helps us learn more about them and understand their tax situation more fully. Secondly, using the quality review checklist in publication 4012 during every review. It's a key step, and we need to make sure we do it with every single review. And then third, comparing all information provided by the taxpayer on Form 13614-C and the supporting documents against the completed tax return entries. If necessary, using reference materials to verify that tax law determinations are correct. And really, I would say that in general, you should be doing that for almost every return just to make sure that it is accurate and it is correct. If it takes a little longer to do the review, that is 100% fine. I would much rather have our quality reviews take longer, but them be of a high standard and make sure that we are preparing accurate returns than speed through them and get through as many quality reviews as possible in a day. So again, quality over speed when it comes to quality reviews. And so here what you can find in publication 4012 is the checklist for a good quality review. And so all items on the quality review checklist must be addressed during a quality review. Again, it's located in publication 4012. So again, these are things that we've talked about, many of them. For example, the volunteer return preparer and quality reviewer are certified to prepare/review this return, and the return is within scope of the program. So that's a pretty simple one. But you also have a little more abstract ones here, such as all eligible credits are correct, that are going to need more tax knowledge. And so that is the end of this training. And so in summary, we have learned that the SPC has determined that there is a direct correlation between the proper use of Form 13614-C and the preparation of an accurate tax return. I would 100% agree with that, and we will be using that form on every single return, and it should be guiding you through the process, and it will make your life so much easier if you use it properly. Secondly, Form 13614-C must be used to complete and quality review all tax returns at VIATC sites. So again, specifically for the quality reviewers, to emphasize this here, the importance of the intake, interview, and quality review sheet does not end once the return is prepared. You should be having it guide you in your quality review as well. Then third, an effective interview must be performed to verify tax information for each tax return. Then lastly, all quality reviews must be conducted by a designated or peer-to-peer quality reviewer. Again, for us, it's going to be a designated review most of the time. And so that should give you the information to take this test. I would still recommend that you review this publication and that you let me know if you have any questions. As always, you all have my email, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So thank you for watching.